I think there's very few aspen stands on the forest that don't have some kind of modification on them. And not individual trees, but individual stands. You're going to see anything from things that happened in the turn of the century to things that happened last week. Actually, I mean, the majority of the culturally modified trees we find are associated with the sheep herding time period. And so the majority of them are in areas where the herders were taking them, which actually covers the entire forest, because the stock driveway is simply utilized at one time of the year when they would actually drive the sheep or cattle to a corral to be loaded up and taken to market. But the sheep herders actually, covered the entire gambit of the area out there, the resource types, and their whole job was to move the sheep along. So you'll find them way away from any kind of stock driveway or anything.
The oldest one that we found was from 1907, a massive old tree, and it's clear evidence that's from where we're at now more than 100 years old. And it's one of these connections to New Mexico. As we go through different people with New Mexico, we see from 1907 onward, and we see quite a few continuing into the 1950s and then right into the early 1960s. So I'm Troy Levada. I'm an associate professor in the Honors College at the University of New Mexico and an archaeologist. And some of my research is on arborglyphs and carved aspen trees. And I'd done research in New Mexico and Colorado on both sheep herders, but other kinds of carved trees from other people. And finding out that these arborglyphs exist, well, I knew arborglyphs existed in Wyoming, but finding out the relationship between them in New Mexico was really interesting to me. To find out it's this not necessarily the same people, but overlapping people, and really interested in some comparison between the two and see what happens when people left New Mexico to come up here and what those arborglyphs were and how they look. But so that's a northern New Mexico name that you don't see in other places. Like up at, there's a lot of Raels near Cuesta.
But Corvo, like, could be.
It could be a last name.
A lot of New Mexicans are Corvo, but Arroyo Seco, I love how
Yeah, it's really clear.
Like, there's no doubt
that's Arroyo Seco, and they're likely together. And so we see this definite connection to New Mexico through there, and then we see some changes over time. There's a shift in population of who's doing the sheep herding. And it looks like we start to see some people from Mexico, and even some other places. There's a Basque carving that probably fits into this time period from the late 60s to sometime in the early 80s. Another one that's probably Basque, but from the Bilbao region of Spain. And then, along with these Mexicans, and then there's a shift very clearly to people coming from Peru to become sheep herders. And along with seeing their arborglyphs, we actually encountered some Peruvian sheep herders. And what's really interesting is to hear their stories, but also realize, again, when I'd mentioned the data points of looking at stories and written history, but also these objects, they didn't understand necessarily how long even Peruvians had been there. So we saw it's helped us work out a time frame of who's been there, and they're all sheep herding, and have continuity, but they're coming from different places. And it also tells us the reasons they come from different places. Why people came here and went away, and why people came here and stayed, but perhaps left sheep herding. And that's a big part of understanding what's going on here.
It's a changing forest. It's going to be a younger forest. And it's also going to be a forest species-wise with a lot of subalpine fir in areas where we're not doing active management. Most of our tree species, we're looking at a rotation age of about 150 years before we want to recycle and regenerate a forest. We're beyond that age in most of our stands. In our active timber areas, we push that down to 120 years. So we've got a high preponderance of old forests, and that's because, in part because of fire suppression that's been done since the turn of the century. The bark beetle, when they attack the tree, they also bring in a blue stain fungus, which ends up clogging the water flowing tubes of the tree. So that's a basic mechanism. A healthy tree will pitch out those beetles. So if a tree's real healthy and growing well, it can initially protect itself with that mechanism. In our older trees, where they're growing close together, real crowded, not healthy, they don't protect themselves as well. There's not as much vigor in the tree, and they can't repel those beetles. It's a very real possibility, and that in the ecological framework of things, you'd expect some fires. The forest will have to decide on their tact on managing those fires, whether we're going to go into a full suppression mode or allow certain fires to burn in certain areas under certain conditions. So I don't think that's all been necessarily planned thoroughly, but those are things that will have to be decided.
The hard part about trees is they die, and so preservation, usually when you think of an archaeological site, we try to protect the resource by avoiding any damage to it, but we can't stop Mother Nature, so there really isn't a true way other than taking photos and documenting what's on them to really protect that resource. Which is one of the reasons it's really hard to identify them as nationally registered significance, because they have an expiration date basically when they die and fall.
Aspen is always susceptible to more diseases and problems than any other species we've got. It's got a thin bark, so anything that damages the bark is going to introduce pathogens which are native to the area and always around there. No, it's never advisable to damage the trees, and I know there's a big cultural desire to leave your name on something, and that continues even to now. But you'll see in recreation areas, dispersed campsites and campgrounds, you'll see a lot of damage to those trees, and then they become hazards for falling. So no, it's not advisable, but it does happen.
So what's interesting to me in some ways is this is actually sort of at a forefront of scholarship in a lot of ways of looking at graffiti. We think of graffiti as something that's written on a wall. We think of graffiti often as something that doesn't necessarily have any story. And there's no doubt, graffiti is often the thing that's not supposed to be written there. But what's happening in a lot of ways is graffiti is becoming something to understand why people left it. It's not the whole story, but it's a story, and it's a way to find things out. And what I'm really interested in is to realize graffiti is also something bigger. It's not on a wall necessarily, it's on a tree. And what does that mean? When you went into a forest as a sheep herder and you left graffiti, you did it because it reflected something about what you're doing. And so what's really interesting to me is this is actually at the forefront of something much larger, of sort of saying what we can look at from the past is a really important thing. And yeah, it's graffiti. I'm not doubting that it wasn't supposed to be written on a tree. Someone's upset about that, but it was written for a reason, and we should figure that out.